Hello everyone, this is Padma Menon from Moving Archetypes. Today we are going to explore the theme of suffering, how it is expressed and positioned in an archetypal wisdom tradition, what it means for us in our usual ways of living and in the more popular ways we understand suffering. I'm going to share a couple of stories. One is my own personal story about how I am able to look at suffering through an archetypal lens in my own life. And I'm also going to share this beautiful story about the deity Shiva, who's the god of dance, and his lover consort Sati. And this story brings the connection between that intimate personal suffering and a macrocosmic cataclysm, and how they're kind of mirrors, or they are expressive mirrors or imaginative expressive mirrors of each other. Before I go any further, I hope that you will like and subscribe and also share your comments. And if you like this video, please don't forget to share it with others who may also enjoy this theme. Suffering is a terrible word in our popular culture. Indeed, we would say that most of the spiritual traditions and philosophies exist so that we escape suffering. Whether it is called suffering or pain or sorrow, we have notions like enlightenment or peace or transcendence, which are meant to escape from suffering or to eliminate or delete suffering from our lives. And who doesn't want to have a life without suffering? There is also a view I find that infuses most philosophical and spiritual traditions, and that is that somehow the body to be embodied itself is suffering. I've heard people say to me, well, to be born itself is a suffering. I must say this makes me really sad. As someone who offers a tradition, a creative, celebratory, ritual, archetypal tradition that is body-led, that is embodied, that is speaking about an intelligence and consciousness that is a gift of the body, the proposition that body is the villain and that this gift of an embodied birth, an embodied manifestation, is the suffering, I simply don't find that meaningful or helpful or even actually true as a dancer. I do understand, though, why we would consider the body as problematic. Because the body is transient, it holds death, there is an ending. The body also brings us to what I call the primordiality, which is those drives in us. And I'm not just talking about the emotions which we have narrated psychologically, but I'm speaking about the deeper drives. I call them the loin longings, loin, or as in yoni, which means that loin primordiality, our desires, our yearning, our impulses, our ferocity, those kind of impulses and sensations that simply don't rise up to the mind and to the mind's control. So the body is the source of that and the domain of that. And that is terrifying. So death is terrifying. These kind of sensations, these kind of elemental sensations where the mystery is right within our own bodies and it's not something out there, that is terrifying. And of course, we become old, the body, to our way of living, we think that is a decline. We think it makes us vulnerable because all our structures of life are based on this able-bodied youth, and therefore we have no space or accommodation for a body that changes and transforms. So we consider that a decline, and it hasn't always been so. There are cultures even today and that would consider that aging of the body in a very different way, as a way of space of wisdom and a very different kind of intelligence. But in general, we don't really hold that space anymore. In the mainstream, we don't have that space anymore. So for all these reasons, the body terrifies us. and makes us feel that we don't have a control about the body, that it takes us into what we consider the wildness, into our mortality. And so the body is the villain because it brings us suffering. We don't like transience. We don't like not being able to control things. We don't like not being able to predict things because the body is unpredictable. Our sensations are unpredictable. So for all these reasons, I can understand why we would think that the body is the cause of our suffering. So many philosophies and spiritual traditions would propose that if we transcend the body, if we can detach ourselves from those elemental impulses of the body, like desire, for example, by practicing detachment or non-attachment, or by any practice that transcends the body, that locates immortality as an opposition to the mortality of the body, and therefore the more we can detach ourselves from the body, the more we will be able to decrease our suffering. And I think that to a large extent, this infuses most of the paradigms by which we live today, this disconnection or denial of the body. And what I sense is that this brings a brutality. This disconnection with the body is also a disconnection with the earth, with the primordiality of ourselves, which is the connection to the primordiality of earth, of soil, of consciousness that is immanent, that sentience that is immanent in all matter, and not just as an exclusive domain of certain life forms. When we accept all this, it is a radical shift about how we position ourselves, participating within reality, within earth, within nature, led by the body. Now, this is a very radical proposition. But what we do instead is that we have these technocratic paradigms which propose connections between us and nature, between the mind and the body. And I feel that they really don't bring us to that radical invitation of being within, being led by nature, by our primordiality and by the body. So that's where I feel that we continue with this hierarchical brutality where we instrumentalize everything. We instrumentalize body, we instrumentalize other life forms to our own self-interest. So body as the villain in the suffering, and the rejection or denial or deletion of body as an essential part of our human experience, in my view, is not only just a tragic thing for creativity and imagination and expression, but also for us to live a more harmonious and connected existence. I don't feel that this body denial has decreased our suffering. I think if anything, it has only increased our suffering. I also want to say before I continue that please do approach this sharing, this exploration, not through a psychological lens, especially as the topic is suffering. It's really important to make this clear. An archetypal tradition may be connected by some people, may connect it to psychological modalities, but in what I offer as this tradition that is body-led, I am very clear that I do not connect it to psychology or to therapy. They are incredibly valuable modalities, of course, and I go to therapy whenever I need, and so that's not what I'm speaking about. But here I'm saying that it does require a certain contemplative distance for us to be able to approach an archetypal exploration, particularly one that is imaginative and creative, which is of course the essence of archetypal traditions, one that is body-led, where there is dance. It does require the possibility of a certain contemplative distance. When we are being subsumed by our personal experiences, that is not the time for this kind of contemplation. So my invitation is, let's leave the psychological narratives or lenses or anything about therapeutic or healing modalities at the door, which is what we are asked to do in an archetypal invocation, is to always leave whatever we know, all of our known paradigms at the door, so that we can allow the revelation and the exploration of this archetypal intelligence fully, without being distracted by what we think we already know. The word suffering in Sanskrit has many more nuances than the English word suffering. For example, it is connected to the word for patience. Now, as it happens in English as well, suffering is connected to patience, because we think of patience as enduring suffering. But suffering in Sanskrit is also connected to words like meditation. For meditation, it is connected to words for a passionate and committed attention or invocation. And it is also connected to the usual words that we think of, like pain or disturbance, unease. What becomes clear in these connections, especially to things like meditation and to that committed, focused, devotional attention, is that suffering is inherent in archetypal invocation. We can say that suffering is inherent in life. Of course it is. It is universal. Who doesn't have suffering in their lives? Of course, we can say that we live in times of great suffering today. There are wars in many different places. There are natural disasters. There are economic issues and health issues. But there has always been suffering, especially at an individual level. We have in our domestic lives, in our everyday lives, everybody has suffering. So it is a universal experience. And in the archetypal tradition, they don't relinquish suffering. We relinquish the narratives of suffering, but an archetypal tradition is always about everythingness, and therefore the suffering is acknowledged as part of this invocation. In a philosophical way, when we consider the philosophy of consciousness, there is the primordial consciousness, which is something that is elemental, something that is of earth, of soil, of body, which means it is a consciousness that is not mind created, that pre-exists the mind. And then there is the mental consciousness, which is that separation, that consciousness that is about separation, defining, categorization, linearity, hierarchy. And philosophically, the suffering is located in the separation, the movement of separation from the primordial whole into this intelligence of separation and definition is that movement of separation. And then when we are able to dance these two dimensions, they are two dimensions of the same consciousness. When we're able, it's like the mental consciousness cleaves away from that more whole primordiality. But when we are able to dance the dynamic between the two, then there is a balance. Now this dance, we can say it metaphorically, but in an archetypal tradition, in an embodied archetypal tradition, it literally becomes the dance itself. And it is also about expression. So expression is a very important component in this interplay. It must be expressed, and it must be expressed in an archetypal way, which is where what we might call the imagination comes into play. It is not a mind-led imagination. Rather, it is an imagination that means it can be free from what is known and allow itself to explore the propositions of an archetypal wisdom, which is always radically different than what is a mind-led imagination. And so when we are able to express this dynamic, then there is a balance. It is not a deletion of suffering, neither is it a celebration of suffering. It is just the suffering and the dance. And this word "and" is a really important word in archetypal traditions, because it is not about this or that. In an archetypal tradition, as I have said before in my videos, it is about the "and." So it's the suffering and the dance. And that coexistence is what is we are able to then express this experience. Rather than suffering the suffering, we are able to express this experience in a poetic way, which is what I am speaking about, the imaginative way, in a poetic way. It is not in an analytical way, but it is in a poetic way. So when there isn't a possibility of this interplay, and when there is this cleaving or separation happening, there is a sense of betrayal. It's like we betray the primordiality. We betray the wholeness of the primordiality through our impulse for separation, never to return, never to participate in this interplay. In archetypal narratives, this is portrayed as, for example, the relationship between the divine masculine and the divine feminine as the lovers. So the divine masculine is the mental consciousness. The divine feminine is that primordial consciousness of body, of earth, of the cosmos. And when they are in union, when they are loving, when they are making love together, that is the dance, that interplay. And when they separate, then there is this longing and yearning. So it's proposed that if there is what we call this suffering when we manifest or when we are embodied, it is this yearning. It is as if we remember somewhere in our depths, and I call it like the loin longing, the loin, the yoni, which is that depths, the primordiality. For example, in yoga, it could be the first two chakras, although in the dance tradition, which in my view is older than the yogic tradition, you see it as that the lower, the yoni, or the between the hips region, where there is the earth, water and fire, the bowl of earth, water and fire. And this loin longing, this longing for union, for uniting bodily, making love, it's as if we hold a memory of it, this yearning, sometimes which we can't even find anything outside of us. We try and throw it onto objects, onto people, onto purposes, onto meanings, and yet the yearning persists. And this is what in an archetypal tradition is referred to as our primordial yearning, that yearning which remembers the primordial oneness from which this mental consciousness cleaved itself. And therefore, returning to that dance, returning to that lovemaking is to restore that harmony and that balance. But of course, it is inevitable that there will be the separation again. And this is the reality. So there is no permanent state that is proposed in a tradition. That is why these traditions have dance, which is like the language of transience, so that nothing is the same, nothing remains permanent, but that there will be this constant separating, yearning, longing. And if we have the inclination and the good fortune to be able to turn towards the call of primordiality, the call of the goddess, to recognize that yearning of our mind, which is throwing itself outside, but actually it is for our own primordiality, then we are able to have those moments, that taste of that dance, and we know that it is possible to return to that dancing time and time again, to reignite that union again and again. There are so many archetypal stories here about the betrayal, about where this goddess exists, because she has been betrayed by her consort. For example, there is a story about the dancer, the archetypal dancer, who's called Urvashi, and who is in a loving relationship with a mortal, and at a certain time she exits because she says that her lover was following a kind of a template. He seemed to be doing all the right things. He was going out and conquering cattle, bringing in wealth, trying to increase his wealth, and he was making love to her 3 times a day. So here's this technocratic model of connection, ticking the boxes, doing all the right things, and yet she says, I leave because you never ask me what I want. So we never turn towards our primordiality and allow the primordiality to lead our movement in this life. We are always imposing a mental model upon that primordiality and expecting the primordiality to squeeze itself into this model, and the goddess exits. And there are many other stories about the exiting of the goddess. Now, the goddess herself is in yearning. So the fact that she falls in love with the mortal, here it is a mortal, but in some of the archetypal stories, it is a deity, the divine masculine. The fact that she also loves and is yearning. And so our primordiality, the goddess, the waters of our depths are also yearning for this union. And in a certain way, our yearning mirrors this yearning of our divinity, our primordiality, of earth, of our body, of the goddess. And when we express that yearning, then we are mirroring, we are dancing the dance of the goddess's yearning. We're mirroring that yearning, and we come together in that mirroring. And again, there is the dance, archetypal dance tradition many times is exactly doing this, mirroring the longing and the yearning and the suffering of the goddess herself. So there is a divinity about suffering. It is not just a human experience. It is not just a punishment that is meted out to us somehow because we have come into body and the divine is not embodied. Rather, it is an experience that is inherent in reality, which includes the divine, which includes consciousness, which includes primordiality. And so the suffering is also something of the divine. And there are many poetic invocations about how the divine suffers, how the divine longs, both as the goddess as well as the male deities, that the stories of their own longing for their lovers. And indeed, in some of the ancient Vedic texts, there are exquisite poems about the longing of the apsaras, the dancer, the archetypal dancers. And they speak about it. They say it is infused with memory. The word for longing includes memory. It's a longing for something we remember. Because we don't long and we don't yearn for something we don't know. So the fact that we have this yearning and longing inherently holds a memory, an ancient memory of oneness. And so these apsaras, they speak of their suffering. They say, let me fling out this yearning. I don't want it in my body anymore. It is so unbearable that I just want to give it to other people. Let it go and punish somebody else. So there is a recognition that our suffering is this yearning, this separation that we feel is inherent, and there is an archetypal wisdom. It is affirmed archetypally, and we are also given a way of being present to it, because we can't deny it, we can't escape it, except in I think in a delusional duality of the mind. But in reality, it is about what can we do? How is this suffering part of the poetry and beauty of reality itself? So here is the andness again. suffering and poetry and beauty and dance and devotion. In the dance text, there is this beautiful combination where they say that an archetypal language, an archetypal dance language, comes from a coexistence of primordiality, which is that loin expression, which is how it is described in the text, that expression of the loin domains, coexisting with an enthronement, which is devotion. We enthrone divinity. We enthrone a dimension of consciousness. Without that, it is impossible to encounter primordiality or suffering of that primordial experience or domain. And then we bring in an expression, some technology of expression, but that expression must be facilitating a connectedness of all these disparate elements. It must facilitate a connectedness. It doesn't facilitate a deletion or a removal, but it must connect these disparate experiences. Like I said, the suffering and the poetry and the divinity, the enthronement, and our elemental impulses. And so the technology is that which connects all these different elements. Let me now illustrate this, because all this can seem like it's quite abstract when, of course, when we talk about an embodied tradition, there is a level of unavoidable abstraction. But I'm going to try and ground this now by sharing two stories with you. One is a story from my own personal life. This is an incident that happened when one of my offspring shared with me their memory of an incident from their childhood, and it was completely different to how I remembered that incident. And when I heard this version, I was completely shocked and shattered. It was as if I was this tree that was simply uprooted and I crashed to the ground, or as if I was struck by a lightning bolt. I could say it was, in my intimate world, it was cataclysmic, and we will come to the connection between that intimate experience of cataclysm and a cataclysmic event in the next story. But I just want to share how this experience was, the magnitude of it for me. And as I was considering this incident and my response to it in the days that followed, I began to find myself exploring it through dance and through poetry. So in fact, even this talk about suffering was birthed from that incident. And what I realized is something about what I said before, about the loin connections and the location of suffering in the intimacy of those loin connections. It is not random or accidental that so much of the stories of archetypal suffering is located in those intimate connections between lovers, the betrayal between lovers, the betrayal between a parent and a child, between siblings, and those kind of blood relationships, but not just blood relationships, the loin relationships, because of that there is a lot of archetypal narratives which are about betrayals between lovers. So that's why I call it that, the loin connections. And even if you think of the famous epics in different cultures, it is often a cataclysmic event that is birthed in something that begins at an intimate level, some betrayal within a family that then escalates into this cataclysmic event. And of course, it may not be that for all of us, when something happens, there is going to be an epic battle. But nevertheless, we can feel those epic proportions. And I don't feel that there is any meaningfulness to comparative scaling of suffering, that lightning bolt or that cataclysmic impact of a suffering is an extremely intimate and personal thing. And I think that that's what those archetypal stories point to, the continuum between those intimate betrayals and its mirroring in this cataclysmic events. But this betrayal, of course, is also based on my own expectations and my own narratives. Those things which I am looking for validation and looking for affirmation, where the more I rely on those technocratic narratives of meaning and validation and approval, the more I will suffer, because inevitably those things are going to be betrayed. So there is an inevitability about betrayal, not only in our usual ways of living, which are mind-led ways of living, but of course we also have the archetypal betrayal, which is the betrayal of our primordiality, the betrayal of the goddess herself. So, and in fact, the two are almost enmeshed together, because when we do the one thing, it is because we are in betrayal of our primordiality. It is when we are disconnected from the sense of who we are at that primordial level, when we haven't explored, inquired into and expressed our primordial yearning, that we are, we are connected, or we are dependent on these mental narratives of meaning and purpose and validation. And it is almost as if there is an inevitability of those two betrayals being connected. We will be betrayed by that domain because we have betrayed this other inquiry. And this centrality of betrayal is brought much more clearly in the next story I'm going to share with you, which is the story about the deity Shiva, the god of dance, and his lover consort called Sati. The story is that Sati was the daughter of a very powerful king, and she fell in love with Shiva, who was a wild, primeval deity clad with snakes and animal skin. And her father despised Shiva. He did not think that Shiva was worthy of his daughter and of their own status as the civilized king. So after the marriage, there was at least for the father, he estranged himself from the daughter. But of course, Sati, the daughter, didn't realize this. The father was holding a very important ceremony to which he had invited all the gods and all the kings of the land, and Sati was not invited because she had this faith in the absoluteness of this loin relationship with her father. She thought that he had simply forgotten, or she thought he assumed that Sati didn't need an invitation. Now Shiva knew better, and he advised her not to go, but Sati is a strong goddess of her own accord. So she decided that she was going to go to the ceremony. Shiva didn't go with her. She went alone. And when she reached there, her father humiliated her in front of the whole gathering. He insulted Shiva, and of course he was also then insulting her own choice and her love for Shiva. Unable to bear this and enraged, grief-stricken, betrayed by this humiliation, Sati immolates herself. When Shiva hears this, he is again overcome with betrayal, grief and rage, and he holds Sati's body in his arms and he explodes into dance. Here is the birth of this creative expression. It just emerges from him. And when he dances, he threatens to destroy all the universes. So the other deities come to him and they dismember this body he is holding. And the body falls down back into earth, and every place a part of the body falls, there is a temple to the goddess that rises up, where the goddess and Shiva are again honored, worshipped, and celebrated. This is such an exquisite story, and it mirrors so much of what was happening in my own story that I shared with you. Because here is the betrayal, which is very evident on all sides, this loin betrayal on all sides, that is happening in the intimacy of this familial trio, the father, the daughter, her, the son-in-law, the lover. This intimacy of these relationships is where this betrayal happens, and it explodes through this creative expression into something that is cataclysmic, that is macrocosmic. But in bringing it into that archetypal level, in making it something that is larger than just this asphyxiating intimacy, there is also a place for spaciousness where things can be dismembered, that we don't have to hang on to this cloistered, intimate betrayal, but that it has an opportunity to break up, to create some space, to fall back to the earth, to replant itself, and to re-emerge. It's as if we surrender our suffering and we express it as a divine suffering or an archetypal suffering, something of beauty, of awe, of beauty, of divinity. And in so doing, it's as if it replants and emerges as something else. So the whole movement of suffering is completely non-linear. And this is why I said at the beginning that we can't bring a lens of necessarily of therapy and healing, which is always, of course, and it must be, about alleviation of suffering. Here, it is completely something other. There is something about that reimagining, that expression through very particular modalities, that poetic imagination, that poetic and archetypal expression of that experience that brings it space, that gives it a spaciousness, and that replants it, that reoffers it into the earth, back into that primordiality, and then it comes up as something else, something that returns into the cosmos, returns into the macrocosm. It may be that when we just simply write the poem, something I felt that in writing these poems, in doing this talk, in dancing, that something returns to that macrocosm. And even though, again, I don't have to know it in a linear way as to what is it doing? Is it curing me of the suffering, or am I curing somebody else of the suffering? But my focus is on that expression of it and attending to the expression of it, the suffering and the beauty and the devotion and the dance, and just as Shiva was doing. And that falling to the earth will be done through that expression, as it happened for him, and that returning as something that is worthy of devotional celebration. That will happen. We don't make that happen. It happens. What we do is that poetic expression, that poetic attending, which is, of course, the heart of an archetypal inquiry or an archetypal intelligence. I hope that this brings you some reflections on an approach to suffering that you may find worthy of exploring in your own lives. I just wanted to end by offering that this sense of betrayal, suffering, it's so important for me, in my experience, to not personalize it. It is not something that is unique to us, to each one of us, even though it is in a way, because we do uniquely undergo these experiences, but we also know that everybody uniquely undergoes these experiences, that even the deities suffer. And that suffering coexists. We're not suffering because we're being punished, but because it is inevitable. It coexists with everything else. It coexists with enlightenment, with peace, with enjoyment. It coexists, and that is the andness of suffering. It is suffering and everything else. And in that beautiful multidimensionality of an archetypal positioning of suffering, we also sometimes come to the most moving and beauteous expressions of life, of our lives, of our embodied lives that is ever possible.